The chute was supposed to come down at 8 o'clock Saturday morning. Luther Bell's oldest son had already hired 2 men with chainsaws. His youngest had taped a yellow demolition notice to the gate. By noon, the old wooden calving chute would be gone, the new barn would be photographed for the buyer, and the Bell Ranch would finally look like something modern people might pay for. Luther did not tear the notice down. He only stood beside it in his faded coat, one hand resting on the top rail, as if the old wood still had a pulse. Everyone in the family thought the same thing. The chute had to go. It leaned, it creaked. It smelled of damp straw, iodine, and winters nobody wanted to remember. Worse, it reminded them of Ruth Bell, Luther's wife, who had spent half her life delivering calves there, and the last part of her life being blamed for the worst calving season the county had ever seen. The buyer wanted it gone. The veterinarian wanted the herd moved into the new barn. The bank wanted papers signed by Monday. But before dawn, the ranch's most expensive cow broke through a temporary fence, crossed the frozen lot, and planted herself beside the condemned chute. Then another followed. Then 6 more. By sunrise, the entire prize herd had abandoned the new barn. And when Luther saw where they stood, he understood the deadline was no longer about selling the ranch. It was about whether the last proof Ruth left behind would be cut into firewood before anyone knew what it meant. Stay with Luther Bell for this story. Because some truths do not speak loudly. They wait in old wood, frightened animals, and places a family is ashamed to remember. And sometimes, the thing everyone wants torn down is the last witness left for someone who can no longer defend herself. By 7:30 that Saturday morning, the Bell Ranch looked less like a home than a place waiting to be judged. 2 pickup trucks sat near the old barn. A bank sedan waited by the gravel drive. Beside the calving lot, 2 men in orange work coats unloaded chainsaws. A yellow notice hung from the old wooden chute. Demolition approved. Luther Bell read it once, then looked toward the north ridge. His oldest son, Caleb, stood with Clayton Reed, the buyer, a folder tucked under his arm. Jonah, the younger son, stayed near the chute with his hands in his pockets, staring at the warped boards like they had embarrassed the family long enough. "It has to be gone before the photos," Clayton said. Behind him, the new calving barn shone in the pale morning. Red metal siding, fresh concrete, automatic waterers, bright lights under the eaves. It looked clean, expensive, and modern. Clayton nodded at the chute. "That thing makes the whole place look neglected." Jonah gave a tired laugh. "We've been saying that for years." Luther did not answer. His hand stayed on the top rail. The wood was cold beneath his palm, worn smooth where frightened cows had leaned during labor. Ruth used to stand there, one hand on a cow's flank, listening before she moved. Dr. Miles Carver stepped out of the new barn with a clipboard, young, neat, and certain. "I checked the facility again," he said. "Clean bedding, controlled airflow, no exposed hazards. Once this chute is removed, there's no reason to keep the herd in the old lot." Luther looked beyond the temporary fence. The cattle were not gathered near the new barn. They stood in a loose line along the frozen ground, heads turned toward the ridge, ears working at the wind. Silver June, the most valuable cow in the herd, lifted her nose and breathed. Steam left her nostrils, then bent low across the mud instead of rising. Luther watched it. Nobody else did. Caleb lowered his voice. "Dad, please. Not today." Caleb was not cruel. He was tired. There were bank notices on the kitchen table, a late tax bill in the bread box, and a 3-generation ranch running out of chances. "This sale keeps us standing," Caleb said. "But only if the buyer sees a ranch he can trust." Luther looked at him. "A ranch you can trust watches its cattle." Jonah shook his head. "No, not this again." Dr. Carver cleared his throat. "Mr. Bell, animals develop habits. If they've been handled in a certain area, they return to it. That doesn't mean the old structure is safer. These cattle never calved in this lot," Luther said. Silence followed. It was true. The prize herd had arrived only 2 weeks earlier. They had never known Ruth's chute. They had no memory to return to. Still, at night, they drifted there. Jonah tapped the demolition notice. "Mom is gone," he said. "And this thing didn't save her name. It just kept all of us tied to what people said about her." Caleb turned. "Jonah." But the words had already landed. Ruth Bell's name had not been spoken plainly in that lot for years. Not since the winter of dead calves, sick heifers, and a county report blaming poor handling at the Bell place. Luther had carried that silence longer than his sons understood. Then, Silver June moved. She stepped to the temporary fence, pressed her chest into the wire, and pushed until the plastic post tipped. Dr. Carver lifted a hand as if calm could stop her. But Silver June did not run. She walked straight across the frosted mud toward the old chute. One cow followed, then another. The men with the chainsaws stopped unloading. Silver June reached the chute and stood with her broadside facing the north wind. The other cattle gathered behind her, settled and quiet, in a way Luther had not seen since Ruth was alive. Dr. Carver stared at the new barn, then at the herd. "That's unusual," he said. Luther reached beneath the lowest rail, where Ruth once kept her small calving knife wrapped in cloth. His fingers brushed old dirt, splintered pine, and something cut into the wood. 3 carved marks. For years, he had thought they were scars from Ruth's blade. But now, with the herd standing exactly where she had once guarded them, the marks looked less like damage. They looked like a message. And if the chainsaws started before Luther understood it, Ruth's last witness would be gone before the truth had a chance to breathe. Before anyone in Willow Creek County spoke Ruth Bell's name with pity, they spoke it with trust. Long before the new barn, before bank notices and buyer contracts, before Luther's sons grew old enough to be ashamed of stories they did not fully understand, Ruth Bell had been the woman ranchers called when a cow would not rise in the snow. She was not loud. She was not soft either. Ruth had a way of walking into trouble like she had already measured it, named it, and decided where to put her hands. In winter, she wore one of Luther's old coats over her dress and kept her hair pinned with a pencil. Her boots were always muddy. Her hands were always scratched. But when she laid one palm against a cow's side, even the men who laughed at women in barns tended to fall quiet. Luther had learned cattle from his father. He learned listening from Ruth. The old calving chute had been rebuilt the second year of their marriage, after a March blizzard tore the first one sideways and left 2 cows laboring in open snow. Luther wanted to buy a steel chute from a dealer in Billings. Ruth said steel held cold too long. She wanted pine rails, packed earth beneath, a gate that opened with the wind instead of against it, and a low sideboard she could drop fast if a cow went down. Luther argued for half a morning. Ruth let him finish. Then she took a ribbon from a feed sack, tied it to a fence post, and made him watch the wind crawl down from the north ridge. It did not blow straight. It dipped, turned along the old barn, and slid low across the ground where the dealer wanted to place the new chute. "Put a laboring cow there," Ruth said, "and you'll chill the calf before it hits straw." So they built it where she pointed. For years, nobody questioned it. Calves came into the world under that crooked roof. Weak ones breathed because Ruth rubbed them until her wrists shook. Cows that would not settle in any other pen stood quiet when Ruth spoke close to their ears. Ranchers who had newer barns, stronger gates, and bigger money still came to Ruth when winter turned mean. She kept notes on everything, not just dates and weights. Ruth wrote down wind direction, frost on the rail, whether a cow faced north or south before labor, how long steam stayed low over a newborn calf, which bedding held damp, which feed changed the smell of breath. Her notebook stayed in her apron pocket, then later in a coffee tin by the back door. Luther teased her once. "One day that book will be heavier than the calves." Ruth looked up from the page. "Good. Maybe then somebody will listen to it." He remembered that sentence more often than he admitted. The winter of 1984 came early and wrong. Cold settled before Thanksgiving, hard and dry at first, then wet in the weeks that followed. Cows were heavy with calves. The county veterinarian, Dr. Harold Vance, had been pushing a new treatment schedule that year, a serum distributed through Mercer Feed and Supply. Everyone said it would strengthen newborn calves through the worst of respiratory season. Dale Mercer, Ruth's older brother, helped deliver the orders. He stood in Luther's kitchen one afternoon with boxes stacked by his boots, telling Ruth it was progress. Ruth checked the labels, asked why some had been re-stamped, and frowned at the way condensation had softened the cardboard. Dale laughed it off. "Don't go making trouble out of damp paper," he said. But Ruth wrote the lot numbers down. 2 weeks later, the first calf died before sunrise. Then another. Then 3 more across different ranches, though nobody put the pattern together at first. In the Bell lot, Ruth began separating cows in ways Luther did not understand. Some went through the chute. Some she held back. Some she marked with a notch on a tag and watched like she was waiting for the sickness to confess. Luther trusted her. But trust did not stop the county from needing someone to blame. When Dr. Vance came to the ranch, he did not arrive like a man looking for answers. He arrived like a man carrying them. He walked through the old lot, glanced at the pine rails, the damp straw, the knife marks on the post, and wrote in his report before Ruth had finished speaking. Poor handling conditions. Unsanitary old chute. Outdated calving practices. Those words traveled faster than grief. By spring, the Bell name had changed in people's mouths. Ruth still got calls, but fewer. Some wives spoke to her at church with careful kindness. Some men stopped meeting her eyes at the feed store. A few ranchers who had lost calves needed the report to be true because it was easier to blame one woman's old ways than admit every modern promise they had trusted might have failed them. Luther wanted to fight. Ruth would not let him do it empty-handed. Anger is not proof, she told him. So, she kept writing. At night, when the boys were asleep, Luther saw her at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, copying numbers from torn tags, dates from feed slips, and names of ranches that had lost calves in the same narrow window. Sometimes she cried without sound. Sometimes she stared toward the calving lot as if the chute itself had become the only witness that had not turned away. Then, near the end of that winter, pages disappeared from her notebook. Luther asked about them once. Ruth closed the cover and said, "Not everything true is safe just because it is written down." He did not understand. He thought she was afraid. Years later, after sickness took her slowly and left her coat hanging by the back door, Luther kept the chute standing because he believed it was the last piece of Ruth the county had not managed to shame out of the world. He fixed rails when they split. He painted nothing. He let the grooves stay. And whenever Caleb or Jonah asked why an old structure mattered more than moving on, Luther gave the only answer he knew how to give. Your mother built it right. But standing there now, with Silver June pressed beside the same old boards and 3 carved marks beneath his fingers, Luther felt the first terrible crack in what he had believed. Maybe Ruth had not asked him to keep the chute because it was a memory. Maybe she had hidden the part of the truth he had never been brave enough to find. By noon, the old calving chute had become the ugliest thing on the Bell Ranch. That was how everyone else saw it. A leaning frame of pine and iron. A gate that dragged in mud. Hinges red with rust. Rails rubbed pale by animals long dead. A roof patched with mismatched tin. The kind of structure a buyer noticed before he noticed good pasture, clean water, or 3 generations of work sunk into the land. To Clayton Reed, it was a bad photograph. To Dr. Carver, it was an exposed hazard. To Jonah, it was a public reminder of a mother whose name had never recovered. To Caleb, it was a problem with a price tag. But to Luther Bell, the chute was not a thing standing in the way of the future. It was a record written in wood, dirt, wind, and the behavior of animals that could not lie. He knew every mark on it. The deep groove on the right rail came from a red cow named Bonnie, who had thrown her weight sideways during a breech birth in 1976. The dark stain near the post was not rot, but iodine spilled the night Ruth saved twin calves in a storm so cold the lantern glass cracked. The low board on the north side was not poorly built. Ruth had insisted it be lower so she could drop it fast if a cow went down and needed room to breathe. Even the crooked angle of the chute had a reason. Most men built square because square looked proper. Ruth built for wind. The new barn, by comparison, looked flawless. Its metal siding caught the winter light. Its doors rolled smooth. Its fans hummed with steady confidence. Its concrete floor sloped exactly as the contractor had promised. Everything about it had been measured, purchased, approved, and photographed. But Luther had never trusted a building just because it looked right from a driveway. He stood between the barn and the chute that afternoon, watching the ground instead of the people. Frost was melting near the barn doors, then refreezing in a thin skin where the shadow held. Inside the new calving area, the bedding looked clean, but the lower boards held a faint shine of moisture. Not enough for a young veterinarian to call dangerous. Enough for an old rancher to remember calves breathing wet air with weak lungs. Emma Bell noticed him looking. She was Caleb's daughter, 17, quiet in the way young people get when adults have been arguing too long. She had come to the ranch that morning because Caleb told her to stay out of the house while the bankman and buyer talked. Instead, she stood near the fence with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat, watching her grandfather watch cattle. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Luther did not answer right away. Silver June stood near the old chute again, not touching it, not eating, only facing the ridge with her ears forward. Two other cows stood behind her in nearly the same direction. The rest of the herd remained spread along the old lot, avoiding the new barn doors as if an invisible line had been drawn in the mud. "See how they're standing," Luther said. Emma looked. "They're just standing." "No," Luther said. "They're choosing." She frowned, but she did not laugh. That made him look at her. For a moment, he saw Ruth in the girl's stillness. Not her face exactly. Emma had Caleb's eyes and Jonah's impatience when she was angry. But she had Ruth's habit of waiting 1 second longer than most people before deciding something was nonsense. Dr. Carver joined them with his clipboard. "I spoke with your sons," he said. "The herd's returning to this area because of scent association. Old wood, old feed, old handling patterns. It happens. These cattle were delivered 2 weeks ago," Luther said. "I understand that. They never worked this chute. Animals can still respond to other animals' scent." Luther looked toward Silver June. "Then why don't they go to the old loading pen? More scent there." Carver paused. Emma turned her head slightly, waiting for the answer. The old loading pen stood 20 yards beyond the chute, darker with years of manure, feed dust, and cattle rub. If scent was all that mattered, the herd should have gathered there first. They had not. Dr. Carver wrote something down. Though Luther doubted the note said what mattered. Jonah came over before the silence could grow teeth. "Dad, don't start another lecture. The buyer is already nervous." "I'm not lecturing. You're doing the thing where you say one sentence and make everybody feel stupid." Luther looked at his younger son, and for once, he heard the hurt beneath the anger. Jonah did not hate the chute only because it was old. He hated it because other boys had once used Ruth's name like a joke. He hated it because every board seemed to say the family had never escaped that winter. So Luther did not answer harshly. He only said, "Your mother knew this ground." Jonah's face tightened. Knowing ground didn't stop what happened. That should have ended it. But Emma was still looking at the chute. "What are those marks?" she asked. Luther followed her gaze to the lowest rail. The 3 carved cuts sat close together, half hidden by dirt and the shadow of the side post. He had touched them that morning. Now, in the clear light, they seemed too even to be accidents. "Knife scars," Jonah said quickly. "Mom used to cut twine there." But Luther crouched slowly, ignoring the pain in his knees. He brushed dirt away with his thumb. The marks were not simple slashes. One was straight, one angled down. One crossed shallow, almost like a half-finished letter. Luther pressed the board. It shifted. Not much. Just enough. Behind him, Caleb called from near the new barn. "Dad, the contractor wants to know if we're clearing the lot or not." Luther kept his hand on the loose plank. For 40 years, he had believed the chute held Ruth's memory. Now he wondered if it had been holding her evidence. He stood before anyone saw the board move, wiped his hand on his coat, and looked once more at the herd gathered where no modern plan had told them to stand. The chute had been misunderstood by everyone, maybe even by him, and before Luther could open that loose plank, he would have to prove the old structure was not the danger. It was the warning. Luther did not ask them to save the chute. Not yet. He knew better than to stand in front of 2 chainsaws, a buyer, a veterinarian, and 2 sons with debt pressing down on their shoulders and say the old wood mattered because Ruth had once touched it. So he asked for one night. "Hold the demolition until morning," he said. "Move the herd out of the new barn before sundown. Let me watch where they settle when the temperature drops." Caleb stared at him as if the request itself had weight. "One night costs us more than one night," he said. "Clayton wants final photos today. The bank wants signed papers Monday. We don't have room for another delay." Clayton Reed stood a few feet away, speaking quietly into his phone, but Luther knew he was listening. Men like Clayton did not miss anything that could change a price. Dr. Carver folded his arms. "Mr. Bell, with respect, herd preference is not proof of structural failure. The barn meets current standards." "The cattle don't read standards," Luther said. Jonah laughed under his breath. "Here we go." The contractor, Evan Pike, had been silent until then. He was broad, red-faced from cold, and proud of the barn behind him. His company sign still leaned beside the new concrete pad. "I built that barn to spec," Evan said. "Ventilation, drainage, gate clearance, bedding depth. You can bring in any inspector you want." "I don't need an inspector," Luther said. Evan smiled. "No. You need string and superstition. That got a small laugh from one of the chainsaw men. Emma did not laugh. She watched her grandfather walk to the tack room and come back with 2 strips of faded cloth. One was cut from an old feed sack. The other was a red ribbon Ruth had once tied around a medicine jar so nobody would mistake it in the dark. Luther tied the feed sack strip to the open frame of the new barn door. He tied Ruth's ribbon to the low side of the old chute. Then he stepped back and waited. Nothing happened at first. The cloth barely moved. Jonah spread his hands. Well, that was worth risking the whole sale. But near ground level, the feed sack strip began to twitch, not outward, like the barn fans suggested. Inward, then down. It snapped once, flattened against the lower board, and held there as a thin sheet of cold air slid through the doorway and crawled along the concrete. Ruth's ribbon moved differently. It lifted, dipped, then streamed sideways past the chute, carrying the ridge wind through the open lot instead of trapping it low. Emma stepped closer. Why are they moving different? Because the barn is catching the draw, Luther said. Dr. Carver crouched near the new barn door, more annoyed than convinced. There are localized drafts in every structure. Not drafts, Luther said. Cold draw, different thing. Evans snorted. Air is air. Luther looked at him. Not to a wet calf. No one answered that. The argument might have ended there if Silver June had not turned away from the barn again before sunset. Dr. Carver and Evan tried to guide her with panels. Caleb shook grain in a bucket. Jonah stood behind her and waved his arms. The cow took 3 steps toward the new door, stopped, lowered her head, and backed away hard enough to nearly knock Jonah into the fence. Behenling, even muttered. Luther said nothing, but his face changed. After dark, he and Emma stayed near the lot while the others went inside to talk numbers. The new barn glowed with electric light, too bright against the black hills. Inside, a few cows shifted restlessly on clean bedding. Their hooves scraped concrete. Their breath gathered white near the lower rails before the fans pulled it apart. Emma held a flashlight low. "Grandpa," she whispered, "look." Moisture had collected along the bottom edge of the calving pen. Not water exactly, a shine, a cold sweat on metal and wood, low enough that a newborn calf would breathe it before anyone standing upright noticed. Luther touched it with 2 fingers. The chill went through his glove. From the far side of the barn, Silver June coughed once. Not loud, not sickly enough to alarm a young veterinarian, but enough for Luther to lift his head like he had heard a nail hit stone. He knew that sound. He had heard it in 1984, before the first calf died. Emma saw his face. "What is it?" "Maybe nothing," Luther said, but he had never hated a word more. When the family finally went to bed, Luther returned to the old chute with a lantern and a flat screwdriver. The lot was quiet except for cattle shifting in the dark. Ruth's ribbon fluttered beside him, red against the old wood. He knelt at the lowest rail and pressed the loose plank. This time it moved farther. A narrow black line opened along the seam. He slid the screwdriver under the edge and worked slowly, careful not to split the old pine. Something inside resisted, as if the board had swollen around whatever Ruth had hidden there. He had just eased it half an inch open when a voice cut through the dark. "What are you doing?" Jonah stood behind him in a coat thrown over his sleep shirt, boots unlaced, anger already awake in his face. Luther froze. Jonah looked from the screwdriver to the plank, then to the chute. "You're hiding something," he said. "I'm trying to find something. Same difference if it kills the sale." "It may have nothing to do with the sale." Jonah stepped closer. "Everything has to do with the sale. You think Caleb sleeps? You think I don't hear him at the table with those bank letters? You think keeping Mom's old board standing is worth watching this place get taken from all of us?" Luther stood slowly. The screwdriver hung loose in his hand. "I think your mother left something here." Jonah's mouth tightened. "Mom left us a name," people whispered behind our backs. The words hurt more in the dark. Before Luther could answer, the porch light came on. Caleb crossed the yard in his jeans and coat, face pale with anger and fear. "That's enough," Caleb said. He looked at the open seam in the plank, then at Luther. "If you interfere with the buyer again, I'll call Mr. Haskins at the bank and ask what it takes to put ranch decisions under managed authority until closing." Emma, who had followed Caleb out, went still. Luther understood what his son was saying. Not guardianship, not exactly, but close enough to shame him in front of his family. Caleb was threatening to take the ranch out of Luther's hands before Luther could ruin the only deal left. The old man looked past them all. Silver June stood in the dark near the barn door, head low, breath drifting close to the ground. Then she coughed again. This time, even Jonah heard it, and the sound carried across the frozen lot like the first small crack in everything they thought was settled. Silver June coughed again before dawn. This time, nobody could pretend Luther was the only one who heard it. The sound came from the edge of the new barn, low and wet, followed by the uneasy scrape of hooves against concrete. By the time Caleb reached the lot with his coat half-buttoned, 3 cows were standing outside the barn doors, refusing to move back in. Their breath stayed low over the ground. Their bodies were turned away from the opening, not wild with panic, but firm in a way that made men look foolish for trying to argue with them. Dr. Carver arrived with his medical bag and a face that had not slept. She may have picked up irritation from transport stress, he said, listening to Silver June's chest. It does not mean the barn is unsafe. Luther looked at him. Then why won't she stand in it? Carver did not answer quickly enough. A younger heifer, dark red with a white face, shifted near the side fence and bawled. Her tail lifted, her back tightened. Luther saw the change before anyone else did. She's starting, he said. Caleb turned toward the new barn. Then get her inside. They tried. Jonah opened the clean gate. Caleb shook grain in a bucket. Dr. Carver and Evan Pike brought 2 panels around her slowly, careful not to spook her. The heifer stepped toward the barn once, then stopped at the threshold as if the floor had turned to water. Her legs locked. Her nostrils widened. When Evan pushed the panel closer, she swung hard enough to knock it from his hands. Easy, Carver snapped. She isn't fighting you, Luther said. She's telling you no. Evan wiped mud from his sleeve. Or she's badly trained. Luther walked past him. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask permission. He only moved with the slow certainty of a man who had been in worse weather, with less help. He opened the side gate of the old chute and dropped the low board Ruth had designed 40 years earlier. The hinge complained, then gave. The heifer turned her head. For 1 second, no one moved. Then she walked toward the chute, not easily, not calmly, but willingly enough that everyone there saw the difference. Luther stood aside and let her enter without crowding her. He did not force her head high. He did not trap her tight. He left room at her flank, shifted the straw thinner near the front, and asked Emma to stand where Ruth used to stand. Here? Emma whispered, closer to her shoulder, not behind her. Emma moved, pale but steady. Watch her ear, Luther said. When it quits flicking, she's listening to pain instead of fear. Dr. Carver opened his mouth, then shut it. The wind slid down from the north ridge, touched the old barn wall, and moved past the chute instead of settling under it. Ruth's red ribbon lifted and streamed sideways in the lantern light. The heifer's breath rose, broke apart, and disappeared. Inside the new barn, the lower rails still shone with cold moisture. Luther rolled up his sleeve. The birth was not easy. The calf had one front leg back, a bad presentation if a man rushed it. Luther worked slowly, speaking to the heifer in a voice so low Emma could not catch the words. Dr. Carver knelt beside him at last, professional pride giving way to necessity. Left leg is back, Luther said. I see it. Don't pull until she gives. Carver hesitated, then nodded. For 10 long minutes, there was no buyer, no bank, no demolition notice. There was only the sound of a cow laboring, men breathing in the cold, and Luther's hands finding the rhythm Ruth had once taught him without ever calling it a lesson. When the calf came, it hit straw with a wet weight and a weak shake of the head. Emma gasped. Luther cleared the nose, rubbed hard along the ribs, and pulled the calf closer to the mother's breath. The heifer turned, lowed once, and began to lick life into what everyone else had nearly forced into the wrong building. The calf breathed. Small, ragged, then stronger. Nobody clapped. That would have been too foolish for such a quiet victory. But the silence changed. Caleb looked at the new barn and saw, maybe for the first time, that expensive did not mean safe. Jonah stared at the old chute like it had betrayed him by being useful. Evan Pike said nothing. Clayton Reed's face tightened in the way of a man watching value shift beneath his feet. Dr. Carver touched the calf's chest again, then looked toward the barn. The moisture is too low, he said quietly. Evan turned on him. Don't start. I'm saying it needs review. Those words did more than any speech Luther could have given. While the others argued in lowered voices, Luther returned to the loose plank. Emma followed, still breathing hard from the birth. Grandpa, she said, Was Grandma right about this too? Luther placed his thumb on the seam. I don't know yet. This time, the board came free with a soft crack. Behind it was a narrow hollow, packed with dust and a strip of oilcloth folded tight against the post. Luther pulled it out carefully. It was not heavy enough to be money, not stiff enough to be a deed. Emma held the lantern closer. Inside were 6 old metal ear tags, a torn feed slip, and a small card darkened at the edges. Luther turned the card over. Cedar Line Stock Serum. Lot 7B. His hand went cold. For 40 years, he had thought Ruth's missing proof had disappeared. But Ruth had not hidden treasure in the chute. She had hidden the beginning of a pattern. They did not take Ruth's packet into the house. Luther would not let it near coffee cups, bank folders, or Clayton Reed's clean hands. He carried it to the old tack room instead, where the light was weak, the shelves smelled of leather and dust, and Ruth's coffee tin still sat behind a row of cracked hoof knives. Emma cleared a space on the workbench. Dr. Carver stood across from Luther, no longer holding his clipboard like a shield. His sleeves were muddy from the calf delivery. Straw clung to one knee. For the first time since he arrived at the Bell Ranch, he looked less certain than awake. Luther unfolded the oilcloth. 6 metal ear tags lay on the bench. Each was dull with age, stamped with a number and scratched by hand on the back. Beside them sat the torn feed slip and the dark-edged card. Cedar Line Stock Serum. Lot 7B. Emma read it aloud softly, as if saying the words too hard might break whatever Ruth had preserved. Dr. Carver reached for the card, then stopped. May I? Luther nodded once. Carver examined the label. This company hasn't existed in decades. It existed in 1984, Luther said. Caleb came in behind them with Jonah at his shoulder. Neither son spoke at first. They had both seen the calf breathe. They had both heard Carver admit the barn needed review, but this was different. A live calf could be called luck. A card hidden for 40 years demanded an answer. Luther pulled Ruth's old notebook from the coffee tin. Most pages were worn soft from use. Weather notes, feed changes, calving dates, names of cows long gone. Ruth's handwriting was small, slanted, and practical. She did not waste ink on feelings. That made the few underlined marks feel louder. Emma leaned over the bench. Here, she said. On a page dated the 3rd of February 1984, Ruth had written 3 numbers from ear tags. 2 matched the tags on the bench. Dr. Carver turned another page. February 6. More numbers. February 9. Lot 7B written in the margin. Then a line that made Luther close his eyes. Moved 3 off treated group. Better breathing by morning. No one spoke. The tack room seemed to shrink around them. Emma picked up one of the tags. Treated group? Luther looked toward the door, toward the chute outside. The marks. He went back into the cold with the notebook in one hand and the lantern in the other. The others followed him. At the lowest rail, Luther brushed dirt away again. 3 carved marks sat beneath the side post, one straight, one angled down, one crossed shallow. Emma held the lantern close. They aren't random, she said. Dr. Carver crouched beside her, comparing the marks to Ruth's notes. On one page, next to certain cow numbers, Ruth had drawn a straight line. On another, an angled slash. On a third, a crossed mark. Carver's face changed before his words did. She was grouping them, he said. Luther swallowed. Treated, Emma said, pointing to the straight mark. Untreated. She moved to the angled mark, and moved. Moved out of the barn? Caleb asked. Luther shook his head slowly. Moved out of the bad air. Moved through the chute. Maybe both. Carver stood and looked at the new barn across the lot. In the pale morning, it still looked clean and correct. But the calf born at the old chute was alive, and Silver June still refused the bright doorway. Carver opened Ruth's notebook again. If these notes are accurate, he said carefully, then your wife may have been tracking outcomes by treatment lot and environment. Jonah gave a bitter laugh. May have been. Carver did not flinch. That is not a small thing. It was small enough for Dr. Vance to ignore, Luther said. At the name, Caleb looked away. Everyone in the county knew Harold Vance's report. Even after he retired, even after he died, that report had outlived him. It was the paper people trusted when they needed Ruth Bell to be wrong. Carver turned another page, then stopped at a place where paper had been torn close to the binding. Pages are missing. I know, Luther said. Do you know who took them? Luther looked at the chute. No. But the old answer no longer felt complete. Jonah folded his arms. So what do we actually have? A few tags, some old notes, and marks cut into a board. That doesn't clear Mom. It proves she saw a pattern, Emma said. Jonah turned on her. A pattern isn't proof. No, Dr. Carver said. But it is the beginning of proof. That silenced Jonah more than Luther could have. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. Do you understand what happens if this gets out today? Clayton walks. The bank hears there may be a dispute connected to livestock records. We lose the sale before Monday. Your mother lost her name for 40 years, Luther said. And we could lose the ranch in 48 hours, Caleb answered. There it was, not cruelty, not shame, math. The kind that leaves no clean choice. Clayton Reed appeared at the edge of the lot, phone in hand, smile careful and already informed. Men like him had a way of arriving after the important part and pretending they had not missed it. I hear there may be some old family records, he said. If they complicate the appraisal, I'm willing to keep this simple. I can buy the property as is, handle the chute removal, and have my attorney store anything historical until it's sorted. Luther looked at him. Store it where? Clayton's smile held. Safely. Ruth's red ribbon flickered beside the rail. For a moment, Luther saw the shape of the trap. Clayton did not need to burn the truth. He only needed to own the place where it was hidden, delay the questions, and make sure Monday came before anyone understood what Ruth had left. Dr. Carver closed the notebook. I need to see the old county report, he said. Caleb looked at him sharply. Why? Because if Lot 7B appears anywhere in that record, Carver said, then this is no longer about an old chute. Luther turned back to the 3 marks under the rail. All those years, he had believed Ruth's silence meant defeat. Now he understood something worse and stronger. Ruth had not been silent. She had been documenting. And if the first packet was only the beginning, then the truth buried in the chute was bigger than the Bell family had ever been ready to carry. By late afternoon, the Bell Ranch had stopped pretending it was only waiting on a buyer. Now it was waiting on a decision. The bank called at 3:15. Caleb took the call in the kitchen, but everyone in the yard could hear pieces of it through the half-open window. Final review, Monday morning, sale agreement, risk exposure. The kind of words men used when they were getting ready to take something without saying take. When Caleb came back outside, his face looked older. They'll give us until Monday at noon, he said. After that, they start foreclosure review. Jonah kicked at the frozen mud. So we have less than 2 days. Luther stood beside the chute, Ruth's notebook under his coat to keep it dry. Clayton Reed arrived 10 minutes later with a new number. He did not say it in front of everyone at first. He asked Caleb to walk with him toward the new barn, then spoke softly, as if kindness required privacy. But Luther saw Caleb stop walking. He saw Jonah look up. He saw the way money moved through both his sons before a word reached him. Clayton was raising the offer. Enough to cover the banknote. Enough to clear the late taxes. Enough to give Caleb and Jonah something left over after closing. There was only one condition. The old records stay with the property until my attorney reviews them, Clayton said when Luther forced the conversation into the open. No one is destroying anything. I'm simply protecting the transaction. Protecting it from what? Luther asked. Confusion. Dr. Carver, standing near the tack room door, looked up from his phone. Evidence is not confusion. Clayton's smile thinned. Doctor, with respect, old ranch notes and a few metal tags are not evidence until someone qualified says they are. And if someone qualified wants to look, after closing, everything can be handled properly. Luther heard the word properly and thought of Dr. Vance in 1984, writing Ruth's guilt into a report before he had listened to her. Caleb stepped between them. Dad, this offer saves the ranch. No, Jonah said. It sells the ranch. There's a difference. Caleb turned on him. You were the one who wanted the chute gone. I wanted the shame gone, Jonah snapped. I didn't say I wanted some buyer locking Mom's records in a lawyer's office. For the first time all day, the brothers were angry in different directions. That should have comforted Luther. It did not, because both of them were right enough to hurt. Dr. Carver had spent the last hour calling old county offices and searching archived veterinary filings. Most records from 1984 were either boxed in storage or badly scanned. But a retired clerk remembered the Bell case because Ruth's name had become county gossip, dressed up as official language. The report came through as a grainy fax to the ranch office. Carver laid it on the hood of Caleb's truck. There it was. Bell Ranch Calving Loss Review, March 1984. Primary cause listed: unsanitary handling conditions, outdated calving structure, inadequate separation. Luther read the words without blinking. He had seen them before. 40 years had not made them smaller. Then Carver pointed to the bottom of page 2. Here, Dr. Harold Vance's signature sat bold and clean. Below it were 2 sets of initials beside a supply verification line. One was unreadable. The other was clear enough to pull the air from Luther's chest. Emmy. Emma leaned closer. Who's DM? Jonah answered before Luther could. Dale Mercer. The name sat in the cold between them. Ruth's older brother. The man who had delivered the serum boxes. The man who had told Ruth not to make trouble over damp cardboard. The man who still lived 20 miles away in a small house behind what used to be Mercer Feed and Supply. Caleb shook his head. That doesn't mean he did anything. No, Luther said. It means he was close enough to sign. Jonah backed away from the truck. So what now? We drag Uncle Dale into this? He's half blind and can barely walk. He was not half blind in 1984, Luther said. The sentence came out harder than he meant it to. Emma looked at him, startled. Luther closed his eyes. There it was, the thing Ruth had warned him about without saying it plainly. Truth did not arrive clean. It came with names attached. It did not only accuse strangers. Sometimes it knocked on doors where families still kept Christmas cards. Before anyone could answer, Silver June coughed from the new barn. Once. Then again. This time, the cough did not fade. It broke into a rough, wet rhythm that made Dr. Carver move before Luther did. Why is she inside? Carver snapped. Evan Pike stepped from the doorway, defensive already. Clayton wanted the herd settled for photos. We moved her in for 20 minutes. Luther's face went white with anger. You put her back in that air? She needed to learn the barn, Evan said. Silver June lowered her head and pulled breath through a throat that sounded too narrow. Dr. Carver dropped beside her with his bag. Caleb grabbed Evan by the sleeve and shoved him back from the stall. Jonah opened the side gate without being told. Luther stood still only long enough to understand the shape of the moment. The past was not past anymore. A bad report, a hidden serum lot, a buyer's condition, a son's fear, a contractor's pride, all of it had led back to the same mistake Ruth had tried to stop. People with authority were again forcing an animal into what looked proper instead of watching what was true. Get her to the old lot, Luther said. No one laughed this time. They moved Silver June slowly, with Carver supporting her head and Jonah clearing the path. When she reached the chute, her breathing eased by a fraction. Not enough to call her safe, but enough to make everyone see the difference. Luther looked at Ruth's notebook, then at the loose rail. The first packet had opened the door. The initials had named a witness. But somewhere inside that old chute, Ruth had hidden the part she had been too afraid to leave in a book. Luther picked up the crowbar Evan had left near the flatbed. Caleb saw it. Dad, I'm done protecting wood, Luther said. He set the crowbar under the rail. I'm looking for your mother's truth. The rail did not come loose easily. For 40 years, wind, mud, and cattle weight had pressed the old pine into place. Luther worked the crowbar under the seam while Caleb held the lantern and Jonah stood with both hands on his hips, looking like a man who wanted to stop him and help him at the same time. No one spoke when the board finally cracked free. Behind it was not a large space. Just a hollow cut into the post and sealed with waxed cloth, feed twine, and the kind of patience only Ruth Bell could have had. Luther reached in and pulled out a packet wrapped tighter than the first. Inside were the missing notebook pages. Emma covered her mouth. The paper had yellowed, but Ruth's handwriting remained sharp. She had written dates, cow numbers, treatment marks, and weather conditions in columns. Besides several calves that died, she had written the same phrase. Lot 7B, box damp. Calf chilled low before cough. Dr. Carver read the page once, then again, slower. This is not just observation, he said. She was building a case. There was more. A carbon copy of a complaint form addressed to the Willow Creek County Livestock Health Office. A handwritten list of ranches that had received the same serum shipment. A folded letter sealed only by age. Luther knew Ruth's hand before he opened it. If you are reading this, then the mistake has happened again. The word stopped him. He had expected confession, maybe fear, maybe a plea to clear her name. But Ruth had not written like a woman asking to be rescued from the past. She had written like a woman warning the future. She explained everything plainly. Cedar Line Stock Serum Lot 7B had arrived at Mercer Feed with softened labels, damp cartons, and re-stamped dates. Ruth had asked Dale to return it. Dale told her the county had approved the shipment and that small ranchers could not afford delay. Dr. Vance signed the supply verification before visiting every ranch. When calves began coughing, Ruth separated treated cows from untreated ones and moved the weakest through the old chute because its open wind path kept low moisture from settling around newborn lungs. The calves moved out of damp air lived longer. The calves from Lot 7B failed faster. Ruth reported it. Then the report changed. The official finding blamed the Bell chute, not the serum, because a faulty shipment would have exposed Mercer Feed, embarrassed Dr. Vance, and triggered claims from half the county. Ruth wrote that Dale came to her kitchen crying, asking for time to make it right. She gave him 1 week. He never did. Luther lowered the letter. For a moment, the cold was gone. He was back in the kitchen in 1984, watching Ruth sit under the lamp, thinking her silence was fear. He had been wrong. She had not been silent. She had been waiting for a man she loved as a brother to stop being a coward. Jonah's voice broke first. Uncle Dale knew? Caleb looked at the ground. Dr. Carver turned to the current barn. And now the same pattern is repeating. Different cause, same failure. A design approved on paper is being trusted over what the animals are showing. Evan Pike muttered, "That barn passed inspection." "So did the serum shipment," Carver said. No one answered. Luther read the last part of Ruth's letter aloud. "Do not keep the chute for my pride. Keep it until somebody remembers how to watch. If the truth costs the ranch, tell it anyway. Land without truth is just dirt with a fence around it." Caleb flinched as if she had spoken directly to him. The consequences arrived faster than the understanding. First, Ruth Bell's disgrace was no longer a family sorrow. It was a county record built on a lie. Second, every ranch that had lost calves in 1984 had been denied the chance to know whether their losses came from their own mistakes or from a shipment people in authority protected. Third, Dale Mercer was not an old uncle on the edge of memory anymore. He was a living witness, and maybe the only one left who could confirm why Ruth's complaint vanished. Clayton Reed stepped closer, face pale with calculation. "Luther," he said carefully, "this is exactly why emotions should not guide business decisions. Old accusations can take years to resolve. Let the sale close. My attorney can preserve everything." Luther folded Ruth's letter. "No." Clayton's jaw tightened. "You understand what that answer may cost?" Luther looked at Caleb, then Jonah, then Emma. "I'm beginning to." Silver June breathed from the old lot behind them, each breath easier now than it had been in the barn. The newborn calf from that morning slept under its mother's chin. The red ribbon moved in the wind exactly where Ruth had tied its memory. Luther placed the missing pages into Emma's hands. "Read every name," he said. "No skipping." Emma looked scared, but she nodded. Then Luther turned to Dr. Carver. "Call whoever still keeps livestock health records. Call the county attorney, and call Dale Mercer." Jonah swallowed hard. "You want him here?" Luther looked at Ruth's chute. Open now, no longer hiding what it had carried. "No," he said, "but the truth does." Dr. Miles Carver did not apologize first. He acted first. That mattered more to Luther than words. Before sunset, Carver had photographed every page Ruth had hidden, every metal tag, every mark carved into the old rail. He took moisture readings in the new barn at calf height, not at a man's chest. He tested airflow with the doors open, then closed, then half-latched the way Evan Pike's crew had left them for photographs. Each result made his face quieter. By 6 o'clock, he sat in the Bell kitchen with his laptop open and wrote a formal veterinary concern notice. Not a friendly recommendation, not a note for later, a report. Current calving facility requires immediate review due to low cold air retention and moisture accumulation at newborn breathing level. He paused before adding the next sentence. Historical records provided by Ruth Bell indicate possible misattribution of 1,984 Bell Ranch calving losses. Caleb stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "That goes to the county?" Caleb asked. "To the livestock health office first," Carver said. "Then the county attorney if they advise it. Jonah leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes fixed on Ruth's letter lying beside the coffee tin. All day, he had looked angry. Now he looked tired in a different way, as if the anger had been holding him upright and was finally giving out. "We hated that chute," he said. Nobody answered. He swallowed. "No, I hated it. Caleb just wanted the bank off us. I hated it because every time I saw it, I remembered boys at school making coughing sounds when Mom picked me up." Caleb looked at him, surprised. Jonah did not look back. "I thought if we tore it down, maybe I wouldn't still be standing there." Luther heard the boy inside the man then, the son who had not understood reports, serum lots, or county politics. Only shame, only whispers, only a mother who came to school with cracked hands and a name other people had already damaged. Luther's voice softened. "Your mother knew." Jonah looked at him. "She knew what people said. She knew what it cost you boys." "Then why didn't she tell us?" Jonah asked. Luther looked at the letter. "Because she was waiting for proof strong enough that her sons wouldn't have to choose between loving her and believing her." That was when Jonah's face broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. He turned away toward the sink and pressed both hands against the counter until his knuckles whitened. Dale Mercer arrived after dark. Emma drove with Caleb to bring him because Luther did not trust himself behind the wheel. Dale was 86 now, thin inside a heavy coat, nearly blind in one eye, with a cane he used more for balance than pride. He looked smaller than Luther remembered. That made the anger worse, not better. Age had a way of asking for mercy before truth had finished speaking. Dale stepped into the tack room and saw Ruth's papers spread across the bench. He knew before anyone accused him. His mouth opened once, then closed. Luther stood beside the old chute, not touching it now. The hollow post remained open. Ruth's hiding place had become a wound in the wood. "Read it," Luther said. Dale looked at him. "Luther, read it." Emma placed Ruth's list on the bench. It was not a long document, but it was longer than any apology Dale had carried for 40 years. Ranch names, cow numbers, calves lost, notes beside several entries. Treated, moved, died, survived. Dale's hand shook when he picked it up. "I didn't know it would go that far," he whispered. Luther did not move. Dale tried again. "Vance told me it was only temporary. He said if we blamed the handling, insurance would settle faster and nobody would lose their supplier. He said Ruth was strong. He said she could take talk better than small ranches could take lawsuits." Jonah made a sound like he had been struck. Caleb stepped toward Dale, but Luther lifted one hand. "No," Luther said. "Let him finish." Dale looked down at the list. His voice cracked on the first name. Harlan Creek Ranch. 2 calves lost. The room held still. Porter Place. 1 calf lost. He stopped. Luther waited. Dale wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and kept reading. McBride South Pasture. 3 calves lost. Bell Ranch. 6 confirmed losses. 2 suspected. Whitlow Place. 1 calf lost after treatment. Moved group improved. By the time he finished, no one in the room was clean of it. Not Dale, who had signed and stayed silent. Not Luther, who had loved Ruth but failed to understand the size of what she carried. Not Caleb and Jonah, who had grown ashamed of a mother who had been carrying evidence for families that had turned away from her. Dale set the paper down. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said. Luther looked at him for a long moment. "Sorry is what you say when you break a window." Dale lowered his head. "You will sign a statement," Luther said. "Tonight. You will say what Vance asked you to sign, what you saw on those boxes, and what Ruth told you." Dale nodded. "And tomorrow," Luther said, "you will call every family name you just read. If they're gone, you call their children." Dale closed his eyes, but he nodded again. That was the first apology Luther accepted, not because it healed anything, but because it finally moved. By morning, word had already begun to travel. Not cleanly, not kindly. Willow Creek had never known how to handle truth without first making it gossip. 2 ranchers drove out before breakfast. One old woman called Caleb and said her father had lost calves that winter too. A retired brand inspector left a message saying he remembered Lot 7B but had been told not to ask questions. No crowd gathered. No one clapped. The community did not transform all at once. It began the way real reckoning often begins, with people going quiet because the story they had repeated for years had suddenly become unsafe in their mouths. Clayton Reed withdrew the raised offer before noon. The bank did not withdraw its deadline. Caleb took the news standing beside the chute. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he pulled the yellow demolition notice from the gate, folded it once, and put it in his coat pocket. "I called Haskins," he said. Luther waited. "I asked for 30 days. Told him we have a veterinary review, possible county records issue, and a live herd that can't be moved until the barn is corrected. And?" He said no at first. Jonah looked at him. "And?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I put my equipment up as collateral." Luther stared at his son. Caleb did not look proud. He looked scared. But he looked steady. 30 days, he said. "That's all I bought." It was not forgiveness. It was not salvation. But it was time. Emma stood beside the old chute with Ruth's notebook held against her coat. Silver June grazed slowly in the old lot, breathing easier. The newborn calf slept in straw where the wind moved cleanly past. Luther looked at his family, at the opened rail, at the barn that would have to be changed, and at the truth that had finally stepped into the weather. Ruth Bell had not been cleared by a speech. She had been cleared by records, by cattle, by a coward made to speak, and by sons who had finally stopped trying to erase the wrong thing. By spring, the Bell Ranch had not become famous. That suited Luther fine. There was no crowd at the gate, no bronze plaque beside the driveway, no grand ceremony where men in clean coats stood under flags and pretended truth had always been welcome. The county review remained open. Cedarline stock serum had been gone for decades. Dr. Vance was dead. Some records were missing. Some families wanted answers. Some wanted money. Some wanted only to know their fathers had not failed as badly as they had been told. The truth moved slowly, but it moved. Dale Mercer signed his statement before a county attorney and a livestock health investigator. His voice shook through most of it. He named Dr. Vance, Lot 7B, the damp boxes, the restamped dates, and the morning Ruth Bell told him the calves were not dying in a random pattern. After that, he began making calls. Some people hung up, some cried, some were already gone, and their children listened in silence to a story that arrived 40 years late. At the Bell Ranch, the 30 days Caleb bought became 60, then 90. The bank did not become generous, but Dr. Carver's report gave Caleb enough leverage to pause the sale while the barn was reviewed. Clayton Reed did not return with another offer. Luther never asked if that was a loss or a mercy. The new barn stayed. But it changed. Evan Pike came back twice with men who no longer joked about ribbons. They cut lower vents along the windward side, changed the gate angle, raised bedding platforms in the calving pens, and opened a section where cold draw had been settling like invisible water. Dr. Carver measured everything again, this time at calf height. Luther watched from the old lot, arms folded. Emma watched beside him with Ruth's notebook open. "Don't write what you think should happen," Luther told her. "Write what happens." She nodded and wrote slowly. The old chute did not remain untouched. That surprised people. Jonah thought Luther would guard every board as if it were Ruth herself. Caleb expected a fight over each nail, but when the south rail showed rot too deep to hold another season, Luther brought out a saw before anyone else mentioned it. Jonah stared at him. "You're cutting it?" "I'm keeping what still works," Luther said. "Same as your mother did. They saved the lowest rail with the 3 carved marks. They saved the hollow post, now open and cleaned, no longer a hiding place. They replaced the weak boards with new pine, left the gate angle as Ruth had built it, and moved one marked rail into the corrected calving area of the new barn. Not as decoration, as instruction. Caleb made the small sign himself from a spare plank. He did not write memorial. He did not write Ruth Bell, wrongfully accused, though the county might one day say that officially. He burned 4 plain words into the wood. Watch the herd first. Jonah hung it where every person entering the calving area would see it. Then he stood back, hands in his pockets, and said, "She would have hated anything fancier." Luther looked at him. For the first time in years, Jonah said his mother's name without flinching. "Ruth would have corrected the spelling if I got it wrong." Luther almost smiled. "She'd have corrected your spacing too." That was how healing came to the Bell family. Not all at once. Not with speeches. It came in the small permission to say her name again. In Caleb leaving the demolition notice folded inside Ruth's coffee tin, not as shame, but as a reminder of how close they had come to cutting the truth apart. In Jonah, oiling the chute hinge before storms. In Emma carrying the notebook in a canvas sleeve and adding her own pages behind Ruth's. By the next calving season, Emma could read things Luther had once thought only Ruth noticed. She saw when a cow stood too square against the wind. She saw when breath stayed low over bedding. She knew the difference between fear and refusal, between habit and warning. She learned that old knowledge was not a set of tricks. It was attention paid long enough to become responsibility. Dr. Carver returned on the first hard night of March. He did not arrive with the brisk certainty of a man coming to correct old ways. He came with coffee, a wool cap pulled low, and a notebook of his own. Emma met him at the barn door. "Silver June's daughter is starting," she said. Carver looked toward Luther. Luther shook his head. "Ask Emma." So he did. Together, the young veterinarian and the girl walked the lot. Emma tied a red ribbon to the corrected gate and watched how it moved. Carver crouched to feel the cold at calf height. Neither of them spoke for a while. Inside the new barn, changed by old truth, a cow lowered herself into clean straw. Outside, the saved rail from Ruth's chute held its 3 marks under lantern light. The calf came just after midnight. Emma cleared its nose before Luther told her to. She rubbed the ribs hard, pulled it close to the mother's breath, and waited until the small body shuddered once, then again. The calf breathed. Luther stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets. For a moment, he saw Ruth there not as sorrow, not as accusation, but as the shape of a lesson that had finally found someone young enough to carry it forward. The old chute had not saved the ranch because it was old. It had saved the ranch because Ruth Bell had listened when everyone else was too proud to hear.